Hello guys, welcome back to the course where we're discussing different gambits from Black's point of view. And we're going to continue with another one after d4, d5, which you might say it has something similar with the Budapest gambit, although the first move is different. It's not knight f6, but it is d5. But the second move is the same. Black is going to play e5, and this is a bit less maybe popular than Budapest. It is called the counter gambit Albin, but it's a good weapon especially for a surprise, because now white again as usual has many moves. He can decide to take the pawn or not to take it. He can take on d5, on e5, e3. He can move, of course, some of the knights, but the best move is obviously to take on e5. If he takes on d5, black should just take with the queen, and then because there is this pressure on the d4 pawn, black has very comfortable game. If white is trying to defend with e3, it's very passive. If he takes on e5, black has a choice between queen takes and maybe even queen d1. I prefer queen d1 actually. And then knight c6. If they defend, you go bishop g4, and then castle queenside. So you will take back the pawn, and white have king in the center. So okay, what if he takes on e5? What is the idea? It is not to take on c4 definitely, and you have to play d4. And this reminds me of one counter gambit in the King's Gambit, where after e4, e5, f4, black goes d5. It's also a very famous counter gambit, but this is a little bit different because the white king is not so exposed. So now white has extra pawn, and he can try to defend it, but the pawn on e5, white can defend it with his knight, maybe potentially with the bishop on f4, which not always they do, but this is all. And black can bring enough hits to attack the pawn. Normally now he goes knight c6, and then the other knight goes to e7 and g6 often. A little bit like in the Budapest, where you go knight g4, but here the difference is that the black pawn is on d4, where she is a bit more active comparing to Budapest, and white doesn't have knight c3. So now obviously again white has many options. What are the most popular moves? Probably we'll have to start with one very famous trap, which is after e3. e3 sounds very logical for white because he wants to get rid of the double pawn. And also, of course, if black takes, white will be very happy to exchange the queens and keep the extra pawn. But here black have this very important check. And now white have to play either bishop d2 or knight d2. Most people think that, okay, bishop d2 is very good enough move because you attack the bishop, and if black takes, queen d2 is just very good for white. Again, he's attacking the pawn. He can trade the queens, and he can keep his extra pawn. But here comes the surprise. Black captures on e3. And now the main variation is if white takes the bishop, what is going on? Black has to take on f2, check, and the white king has to defend his queen, so he goes to e2. And obviously this is good for black, but it's not only good, but it's even winning, but you have to find how to win. You should not take the queen. You should not give bishop g4, which is even worse, because bishop g4 now, after knight f3, white is winning. So you have to take the knight and to promote, but not to promote the queen, because if you promote the queen, white intermediately takes queen d8, king d8, and then he takes rook g1. The point is to under-promote the knight, because now white doesn't have time to take because of bishop g4, so he has to move the king back, hoping to take this knight later, but after queen h4, g3, queen e4 check. This is a very common variation, and after queen e4, yeah, you take the rook, so he has to move the king, and this is obviously winning for black, extra piece and very, very strong attack. So if white goes for this line with bishop d2 here, maybe instead of taking the bishop, of course, he has to take the pawn. And now the game is around equal, but it's very comfortable for black, who can even, I think, could have some slight advantage, because now, for example, you can give this check, and after g3, queen e4, attacking both pawns on e5 and also on e3, because the bishop is pinned, and if white takes the bishop, you take the rook. So white cannot take the bishop. He has to play either knight f3 or queen f3, let's say knight f3. And here black is choosing between, he has two good options. You can simply, of course, take the pawn, and then most likely you have to just trade everything and to play against this pawn, which is potentially weak. Or you can go bishop g4, another pin. White have to deal with it, and then you take here. The queen has to defend the knight, so white has to take with this knight, queen e3, and this is something similar, but I think maybe even this is better, because the knight is pinned, so the pawn immediately is hanging. So obviously this is very good for black. That's why e3 is not a good move. It doesn't help for white if he moves the knight to d2. You can play the same moves, take, queen h4 check, and then queen e4, and again you win one of the pawns, and this is better for black. Okay, this is about the move e3. If white plays e4, what to do? In this case, this check is not so promising, because there is no follow-up after bishop d2. En passant obviously is bad, so black simply has to develop, knight c6. If knight f3, bishop g4, and then you can take the pawn back, and if you take the pawn back, actually this could be better for black long term, because you have this passed pawn. So white usually wants to defend this pawn. But it is a bit risky for white, because you can see he's playing only with his pawns and all the pieces are not developed. And now black has a couple of good possibilities. The main move is f6, which is kind of forcing white to take, otherwise what was the point of all this? And then when you take, white have to defend the pawn, bishop d3, and now bishop b4 check, developing the bishop with a tempo. So let's say knight d2, and after this black is developing, and one of the ideas is to go knight g4 and then knight e3. So this is an excellent compensation for black, I think. And there is an alternative, as I mentioned. Here you can even play the move g5. G5. And now, yeah, it looks like you're exposing a bit your king, but then you're trying to win this pawn on e5. Now the best move for white is f5. And here there are dozens of games. Almost in every game, black takes on e5. And then it could be, let's say, knight f3, bishop b4 check. And now there are various options. The engine suggests some line where you go knight c6. For some reason he likes this move, but also he suggests completely new ideas in this position. There is this interesting move h5, which has been never played, but the computer likes this move. And now the idea of this move, I suppose, is to meet knight f3 with g4. So then if you don't play knight f3 with white, what is your next move? it is not clear here. H5 and then G4, so the knight cannot go to F3, which looks very interesting, by the way. Alright, this is about the move E4. What else white can play? We have seen E4 and then E3. Also there is this move A3, which is one of the main, but he often transposes because the main move is knight F3. And now black should play knight C6. The attempt to push C5 is not very promising to try to create a nice center, because after, let's say, E3, then you play this position. I don't think that there is maybe enough compensation, because now white plays very simple castle and then knight d2, rook e1, and black king is still in the middle, so black have to develop his pieces, and it will be difficult maybe to take the pawn back. That's why black plays knight c6. The move order can vary. Now white can start with knight f3, or with a3, or with g3, as we will see. Now let's see what are the options. If white again tries to go e3, okay, in this case we don't have this trap as before, but still this is good enough move, because now you simply take on e3, and okay, if he takes on b4, pawn takes f2 is not winning, maybe immediately, because king e2, but still after queen d1 and knight b4, black has excellent position. And if they take bishop g4 is very good. This is looking very good for black. So e3 is never a problem, unless the pawn is on a3, and then you don't have this check from b4. And indeed now a3 is one of the moves. Also, of course, white can try to defend the pawn a bit like in the Budapest Gambit, and then to move the knight to d2. In this case, the check on b4 is not that good anymore, because after knight d2, white will play a3, and you will have to trade. So better is to start with this move, and then with knight g6, because now the bishop has some problems. He has to go back. I don't know what else to play. And now very important move is bishop f5, not allowing any moves on the diagonal. And also now black is threatening knight b4. So for white it's very difficult to develop his bishop, because c3 you just take and he has those double pawns. There is no g3 because the bishop is blocking g3, so he can try a3 to stop knight b4. And now, for instance, h5 looks very promising. Probably they have to play h4, and then queen e7, attacking the e5 pawn and preparing the castle, and black has already an advantage. So let's see finally the main moves, which are for white a3 and g3. Those are the critical lines. a3. One of the ideas is, of course, to push b4 and bishop b2, or the other idea is simply to avoid those checks and at some moment to play e3 to get rid of this pawn. What to do after a3? There are many lines for black here, and I will give you the most popular ones. You can move, of course, one plan is to play knight e7, knight g6 immediately, trying to take the pawn back as soon as possible. The other is to develop the bishop. It could be bishop g4 or also bishop e6. Those are quite popular moves. Bishop e6. In this case, white has some possibilities, because now he has to defend the pawn on c4. So it is basically between e3 and knight d2. e3, now as I mentioned already, this is a possible line, of course, for white, because there is no check. And usually black takes on e3, so it could lead to this endgame after queen takes, rook takes, bishop e3, where black is a pawn down. And then he usually is trying to get the pawn on e5 back. And after knight c3, now the main move is knight g6. I don't know, knight f5 also I think is interesting maybe, where black is not trying to take the pawn, but maybe rather to take the bishop on e3 and later maybe with g6 to try to win the pawn, but this is more popular. And now the most critical line is knight b5, rook d7, and then knight d4, because that way white takes the pair of bishops, so he can play this endgame, which is a bit maybe better for white, I don't know. Although we have knight d3 check as a threat, but okay, the pawn structure now, this pawn on e6 is not so good. So this is one possible line. If white goes knight d2, which is the other possibility to defend the pawn, black normally follows with this, or with queen d7 and castle. And then obviously there are many options, but maybe b4 seems like the most critical, because white instantly is getting some space on the queen side. And let's say knight g6, bishop b2 is possible, and then there are again many games. Sometimes black takes the pawn, knight e5, sometimes queen d7 they play, even some people go a5. Let's say queen d7 is possible, then castle queen side. And it's a very tricky position, because white also have to develop his king side at some point, so he needs some time to do this, maybe with g3, and black can take the pawn back. So it's a very interesting line, but more popular are the ones with bishop g4 and knight e7. Bishop g4 is the second most popular move, and now usually white is defending with the knight, because maybe black can capture this knight and double his pawns. And here black again has different ideas, depending on now how quickly he wants to castle queenside. It is between knight e7 and queen e7 and queen d7. In case of knight e7, now they can play h3, and in this case black should take the knight, because bishop h5, g4, bishop g6, maybe it's okay, but then the knight on e7 have to go to c8, not to g6, and he wants to go to g6. So this is kind of more in the spirit of the position. And then indeed you will win the pawn. Normally they go something like e3, and again white has the pair of bishops, but everything is symmetrical. You can trade and then to play this position. Or you can play the queen to e7 immediately. In this case, after h3, already you have a choice. You can still take on f3, but you can go to h5. For example, if you take, now knight e5 is losing the d pawn, so it is better to start with the castle and then to try to take the pawn. But of course white can defend with the bishop. So in this case, maybe you can try h6, g5, bishop g7, but most people, and also the engines, they like the move f6, where simply black is giving the pawn and he has this compensation. Then you can jump knight e4, maybe g5, bishop g7 is possible, and white have some issues with his king, how to develop. Black have good compensation. If oh, by the way, okay, there is another move here, queen d3, which is for some reason very popular for white, but I don't know exactly what's the idea, because if you take queen f5, knight e7, it's not good for white, and if he takes, then what is this queen doing on d3? I'm not really sure. And then, as I mentioned, there is this alternative where instead of this move knight e7, sorry, instead of taking on f3, you can go bishop h5, but then they go g4, so it's very strange. Sometimes white goes a3 and b4, sometimes h3 and g4, so we have to expect all of this. And in this case, black should castle, white also castle, and this is very strange position where white have castled, but he pushed g4, so of course black usually want to exploit this, and white now has to keep the file closed, g5. And now most people play h4, which engine don't like this move h4. Then simply white goes b4 and starts to attack on the queen side. Probably better is not to play this, but just to take the pawn, to keep it more simple. And then everything is equal. In case of knight f3, the queens have to go to e8. This is the best square for the queen, and then you just develop your pieces, and it's very complicated game. e8, by the way, is not allowing as well queen a4, which is also good. So this is about the line with bishop g4. Sometimes black as well is trying the move a5, which is not that popular, but it's pretty standard, you know, for those positions. If you try to flip the board from, and you play this with white, you know, this in kind of Benoni positions where you always meet a6 with a4, it looks not so bad, but I don't know exactly why this is not popular, because now, okay, when white insert those moves, the problem is that there is no check. So when he goes e3, we don't have the same trick. But we can maybe just develop, and I don't see a big issues here for black, because now, since I want to capture on e3, white have to take. And here the funny part is that you don't take with the knight as usually within the other positions, but you take with the bishop, which is a bit a rare idea. Now the threat is bishop f2 check. So white either have to defend his queen, or let's say like this, and now black is just developing, for example. And for white it's not easy to keep the pawn, and black have very simple play. You want to get the knight out to g6, bishop f5, and if he takes, you take with the queen always, and then the pawn is hanging. If he takes, then the bishop is hanging, knight b3 is coming. So this is, I think, very good. So yeah, this looks to me interesting, the move a5. Or if they play g3, which is the other way to develop, of course, the bishop, you just can develop, and now white doesn't have this those ideas with b4, which he sometimes have, and you can just take the pawn. And I think this looks fine to me. White has better development a little bit, but black can move simply the bishop to c5 or somewhere, castle, and if he can do this, I don't see any problem. So a5 to me is a bit underrated maybe. And now let's finally go to the main move, which is knight e7. Knight e7, now white again has b4, g3, b3, knight d2, various moves. b4 is maybe the most popular, and then bishop knight g6, sorry, bishop b2. So in this case white wants to attack and to win the d4 pawn, and he has already 3 hits. So what can black do? Black should go a5 to force white to push b5, which will give him later some outpost for his bishop. b5 is okay, the most natural move. Then take the pawn, and also black is attacking the pawn on c4. So if knight d4, knight c4, already black is having advantage. white usually takes, and now there are two options for white: e3 or bishop takes d4. If bishop takes, of course, knight c4, and then e3 could transpose to, e3 actually you just go bishop e6. Or it could be e3, bishop e6, and now basically this is transposing to the same position. You have to remember that after e3, bishop e6 is attacking the pawn, and white cannot defend it, so he has to take. But the line is quite long, so it's kind of forced line. Queen c2 now attacking the knight. d6 is the best square, and then white is developing, so he's claiming that he now is going to play castle, knight c3, rook d1, and his bishops are a bit annoying, pointing towards the king, so black have to first find how to move his bishop without losing the g7 pawn, and here usually they play queen g5. Now if castle, bishop h3, f4 is the best move, and now check. So queen f2, this is fine to exchange the queens. g3, and here there are some deviations. Some people go queen h3, others go queen h5. Both has been played a lot. Queen h5 is putting pressure on the b5 pawn, but queen h3 is not allowing immediately to castle. So maybe queen h3 looks to me a bit more active. And then again, white obviously has different options: knight c3, e4. So e4 maybe is more critical, because immediately you have to know how to deal with those pawns who are rolling, like f5, e5, it could be coming. So here what I think is the best, and what usually people do, is to play rook d8 first. Do not move the bishop. Okay, obviously bishop g7, so you cannot move, but also don't push the f pawn. Rook d8, so you are putting some pressure potentially on this bishop. And after f5, the next move is very difficult to find if you don't know it. And this is the best move: bishop to c4. What is the point? Why we are sacrificing one piece? The idea is that if they take and take here, and now after queen g2, white doesn't have any check. The rook is hanging, and queen e4 check is coming, so he will lose the bishop. That's why here white usually goes knight c3, just to develop. And again, this is a bit tricky. Now already bishop e7 is coming, because there are some tricks. If you take on g7, bishop d3 and knight f5 attacking the queen. So black wants to castle. And yeah, now most people go f6, which I don't know if this is the best, but this is what everyone plays with white, and black now takes. And this is very messy position, but I think it's okay for black. After all, when you play this gambit, this is what you want: messy position. And just white have to play some positions which are not standard, because all the d4 player, they like to play very positional, solid. So sometimes when you can move them out of the standard positions, and they have problems. Okay, finally now let's see the other main move, which is g3. Both moves are very popular, a3 and g3. In this case, white simply wants to develop bishop g2, castle, knight d2, and then to start his play on the queen side. And here black again has a lot of options. Knight e7 I think is the main move. And after bishop g2, knight g6. So now white normally castles. If he tries to be clever, he can play bishop g5. And then bishop e7 looks normal, but for some reason, okay, the engines don't like this move, and they think that queen d7 is the best. This is also what most players do, but this is an unusual move. That's why it's important to know it, because queen d7 is not a natural move. And after castle, the point is that you go h6. The bishop has to go back, let's say back to c1, and then you take the pawn back. So basically he lost some time with the bishop. Okay, queen d7 is maybe not the most useful move, but you can always move the queen away if needed. Then there are some games where black is just developing, and I don't see any problems here for black. Let's say queen f4 has been played dozens of times, knight takes, castle. So black is perfectly fine. There is no problem with this pawn, because you can defend it very easy, and then if he takes knight d4, and yeah, everything is fine. So castle is, I believe, the best move, and then black takes the pawn. So this leads us to this position, which is quite popular, and now white have two plans. Knight a3. This move looks a bit strange, but it has some idea which, yeah, could be annoying. Here some people take this knight, then queen a4 check is coming, or you can just develop. And then the plan for white is to go to b5, and after castle he takes with the knight, and then we have this situation, b3. He wants to put the bishop on b2, but black is not allowing this. If he takes just queen d4, if e3, c5, and this looks also good for black. So the most popular line is b3, and then bishop c5 is one move which is quite popular. Bishop b2, castle, knight d2, and then a5 is the main move, which is against b4, but also the idea is that in case of knight e4 you can move the bishop back and to keep defending the pawn. Let's say queen d2 is played usually now, rook e8 is one of the moves, so bishop f5, and then c5 you defend the pawn. This is one option. Or as I mentioned, you can go bishop e7, because maybe that way when white moves the knight to d2 and e4, the bishop is not under attack, but then you have to go c5. And this looks also interesting, because now it seems that you have problems after e3, because the knight is hanging, but after bishop g4 and f3, for example, this is actually very good for black, because the point is that you want to go knight e3, and this is even losing because of knight e3, and black has very big advantage. White have to play some move queen d2, but okay, it's a bit artificial. I don't know, we can always go knight f3, even if you lose the pawn, let's say something like this. Black has very good compensation of this bishop on f3, there is no rook d1, the king is cut, you just bring the rooks in the center. So this is also possible. Okay, so this is in case you go knight e7. Also you can go bishop e6 and bishop g4. Bishop e6, the line goes something like this, when black castles here and then he wants to go h5. But it's a little bit risky line, because white also can start some attack. And then obviously there are many deviations, but some games go like this, and now white goes knight g5, a bit surprisingly, but that way he is trading the bishop, and it secures that the bishop on g2 will stay. And now, yeah, this is something which is possible, and then to take with something on d7. This is one possible line. Bishop g4 is actually a bit more popular than bishop e6, which has pretty much the same ideas, but the bishop is on g4. So I don't know what is the difference now. Let's say he can defend, or he can develop, of course, the knight. And now again you can play h5, and the idea is h4, and to open the, like in the dragon, the h file. And if they want to block it, then you just go for the other plan with knight g6, and eventually here you have to play king b8 to defend on a7, and after that you can try to win this pawn on e5, or if they go a3, if white allows you h4, of course you have to play h4, otherwise why did you play h5? And then this could be some possible line, take, and now the engine is like here the move f6, because you instantly have to bring your pieces into the game. If he takes knight f6, if not, you just take knight e5. So this is an interesting variation. And finally, I think maybe we haven't covered knight d2, which often just transposes to the lines now, depending if he goes a3 on g3. So it's not completely independent move, because if you go knight e7 and he, maybe this is, yeah, this is the line which we have to see, yeah, knight b3, because this is a new line which is not possible in the other files. So knight f5 now, this is actually a line, yeah, it's interesting. So now the knight on f5 is not, yeah, it's not like in the other lines, and white now goes e4. So basically this is kind of a forced line where now white takes with a pawn. But he has extra pawn, but again he has those double pawns on the e file, which eventually I think black will be able to take. Here is very important to exchange this knight from f3, so when you go knight c6 later, to try to win this pawn. Yeah, or if you don't want to allow for some reason this line, you can go bishop g4, and now they go a3, and again you can just revert to some of the lines which we have seen. Some people also sacrifice pawn by playing f6. I don't know, it's possible. Yeah, f6, take knight f6, and then just develop. So I think more or less, yeah, we have covered everything, and you can see the main lines in this counter gambit. Black wants to develop quickly and to use this d4 pawn, you know, to not allow white to develop so easy. His knight on c3 or e3 comes sometimes more difficult. So I think it's a possible opening, and it is interesting maybe to learn, to study, and to try sometimes, because also white is usually never prepared, unless of course he is a very good player, so he will not know what to do, and after e5 who knows what white will play. Okay guys, I wish you good luck with studying this line, and we'll see you in the next chapter.